start?
I don't know kung 800 guys lost look, 800 lives na. Hello and welcome to the first episode of the podcast. I'm your host for today, Jasper, and I'm joined with Danji, Marvin, LJ, and Mia. In today's episode, we will be discussing a very interesting topic, the Mount Pinatubo eruption. From this, we will be breaking up the topic into two main categories, before the volcanic eruption and after the volcanic eruption. And to make it more interesting, we will be having an affirmative and a negative side, both of which will be showing the two different perspectives of how the government handled the situation of this disaster. But before going any further, I will give a brief overview of what is the Mount Pinatubo eruption. The Mount Pinatubo eruption is the second largest volcanic eruption of this century and by far the largest eruption to affect a densely populated area. Occurred at Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines on June 15, 1991. The eruption produced a high-speed avalanche of hot ash and gas, with giant flood flows, and a cloud of volcanic ash hundreds of miles across. The impacts of the eruption continue to this day. Even though the volcanic eruption occurred a really long time ago, people still speculate how the government responded to the situation, or did they really respond at all? To address this, we will be having the affirmative side first to share their perspective on how the government responded before the volcanic eruption occurred.
So before the volcanic eruption reached its peak, the government actually prepared for the worst. So they had an evacuation plan. So when they had a 6-mile radius danger zone established, they began the evacuation as early as April 1991 and then proceeded to evacuate the indigenous Aita people from the slopes of the Mount Pinatubo and then the low-lying areas of the volcano. And then next, they had a collaboration, the PHIVOLCS, or the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, collaborated with the UGS or USGS or the US Geological Survey for monitoring and assessment of the volcano. So speaking of monitoring and assessment, included na dire ang equipment. So they installed seismic and tiltmeter station to measure the sulfur dioxide levels in order to predict the eruption. And lastly, they disseminated the information to the people for them to have warnings of the situation and then take action or know the actions before, during, and after the event. And I guess that's all from the affirmative.
Thank you, Marvin, from the affirmative side. Now, you mentioned earlier that the government implemented an evacuation plan before the volcanic eruption occurred. I just want to ask, how many months was it before the volcanic eruption occurred that the government implemented this evacuation plan?
I think it was 2 months before because the volcanic activity started during April 1991 until June 15, 1991, where the volcanic eruption reached its peak.
Thank you, Marvin. Now we will go on to the negative side. What are your comments on the government's response before the volcanic eruption? Were they lacking, or perhaps were they too complacent with their provided support?
So, before the volcanic eruption, there were no volcanic hazard maps. Pero kato naka-discover sila, naka-detect sila nga na volcanic activity sa volcano, dahil ang PHIVOLCS BDAP nga team, kaya nag-compile sila ng mga hazard map, and then nakahimo na sila. So they made the hazard map kaya para makakita sila sa mga areas na vulnerable sa ashfall, mga mud flow and ash flow. Tapos they also expected na the worst case scenario.
So, majority of the people living in the vicinity was lang na-aware about sa volcanic hazards and also was lang nagtuo kung unsa ka grabe ang impact sa volcanic eruption.
So, another thing a condition sa ilang evacuation centers. So, before pa po sa volcanic eruptions, ang government nag-announce na siya sa community about sa evacuation procedures. Pero, ang sa mga evacuation centers, uban nga evacuation centers, extremely difficult ang ilang mga condition dito. So, one thing dito aguban nga mga tao, tagaan na sila mga tent. Yung kanang tent since volcanic eruption man ang disaster, mura dili siya enough para makover sila sa mga elements nga mabuga sa volcano. Another thing kay ang mga evacuees kay magkasakit sila sa mga extremely hot and cold nga weather nga wala gy basic sanitation sa area. So tungod ani nga mga factors kay magkasakit sila, mga children pod na atoy mga most cases nga naa kay diarrhea anya measles. Tapos sa DSWD na per report nga may 156 nga 8 nga children ag namatay tungod sa aning mga condition and diseases.
And lastly, cultural differences also played a significant role in spreading diseases like measles. According sa Department of Health, the immunization campaign failed to reach all the children in camps, particularly sa Aita community, due to the cultural gap between them and the health workers. While other health workers kay nag-assume pod nga ang Aita people is nag-avoid of Western medicine, others like the Sisters of the Franciscan Missionaries of Mary is aware na sila nga ang Aita people is willing sila mo accept og help sa Western medicine if necessary na jud. Pero however, tungod sa lack of rapport between the health workers and Aita evacuees is nag-result siya of lack of understanding sa Aita community. So, ang malnutrition is lowers in ang mortality rate sa Aita children.
That really is an unfortunate predicament. Thank you, Negative Side, for sharing your perspective on the volcanic eruption. Now at exactly 1:42 Pacific Standard Time, on June 15, the final climactic eruption of Mount Pinatubo began. It caused numerous major earthquakes, supermassive pyroclastic surges, and intense atmospheric pressure variations. And unfortunately, paired with a typhoon that struck the island the same day, typhoon rains mixed with the ash deposits caused a messy rain of mud and massive lahars. Eventually, 847 people were killed by the eruption, most of which were caused by roof collapsing under a load of accumulated volcanic matter, a hazard amplified by the simultaneous arrival of the typhoon. The immediate aftermath prompted several impacts that affected the lives of local residents, including environmental devastation. The eruption resulted in a thick blanket of ash covering the surrounding areas. Also, societal impact, the human toll was covering the surrounding area. Societal impact, the human toll was heavy with over 800 lives lost and approximately 100,000 people left homeless. Paired with economic loss, economically the eruption was a disaster with an estimated 650,000 workers losing their jobs due to the destruction of agriculture and infrastructure. The damages were estimated at around $700 million. To know more on how the government responded to the situation, to address this, we will be having the affirmative side first to share their perspective on how the government responded after the volcanic eruption occurred.
So after sa eruption, daghang private sectors o ang government help sa victims by sending the massive relief goods. Ang National Disaster Coordinating Council nagpatabang pod sa military forces para sa evacuations and rescues. And ang government agencies pod gitransform niya ang school and hospitals into an evacuation centers. And ipuno po nila adto ang mga medical professionals for their medical assistants, social workers, and teachers to provide for their essential needs. Unjang, DSW said, naghatag po sila sa emergency aids for the displaced families, and while the DOH ni provide po sila sa medical care and public health. And yeah, later on, some host of several countries ni hatag po sila humanitarian relief assistance sa Philippine government and its supporting NGOs, including the Philippine National Red Cross. And napoy ubang international organizations ni help po sila o
like hatag og humanitarian relief assistance like World Health Organizations, UN, UNICEF, UNDRO, and WFP, like pag-give sa cash donations or relief items like food packs, medicines, and shelter materials.
Thank you from the affirmative side. Now we'll go on to the negative side. What are your comments on the government's response after the volcanic eruption? Were the help delayed enough?
So many citizens expressed their frustrations and disappointment with the government's response to the crisis. One of the primary sources of the dissatisfaction was the perceived inadequacy of the government's disaster preparedness and response mechanism. Despite sa warnings sa mga authorities sa citizens, is na-feel gihapon sa mga citizens nga na-fail ang government o warn sa mga citizens about sa mga possible dangers na makause sa eruption, and it leads to unnecessary loss of life and property.
So another thing, kanay concerns ag government na concern sa pag-handle sa financial aid nyo para sa community. May mga reports na corruption and katong financial aid ni inraw na ihatag sa community kay dili daw siya distributed fairly. And then there are also complaints sa mga victims sa eruption nga may mga delays sa pag-deliver sa aid, nga tungod atong mga delays kay nadugay sa dagilang pag-repair sa ilang mga houses.
Thank you, LJ and Gia, from the negative side. Thank you both sides for sharing your perspective on the situation.
So, human naman tagkuan, storya about sa before and after na responses sa government, and we all gave our opinion on the situation. How about you, Jasper? Ano sa imong ma-say about sa situation kung side dapat ma-improve pa sa government or kung side ba ka sa affirmative side?
For me, if I were made to choose between the affirmative side or the negative side, I will be going for the affirmative side. The help of the government by giving warnings and making the residents evacuate, not only did it work, but it saved multiple lives. While the negative side also gave reasonable arguments in the end, while there were areas for improvement, it's crucial to recognize the efforts that were made to mitigate the impact of the disaster.
Okay na to.
After na ko kasulti sa hanggang English, mo sa
Kuan, with all said and done, that will all. With all said and done, that will be all for today's episode. Thank you everyone who's watching and have a nice day. Bye.
Balik!
Usually we don't say
With all said and done, that will be all for today's episode. Thank you everyone who's watching and have a nice day. Bye.
Atong tanawon ni.
Before we end today's episode, Mia will provide us an additional information on the Mount Pinatubo eruption.
So, did you know guys that of all people affected, the Eta community were the ones who was affected the most? Okay, ang ilang economic and cultural life kay ato man nag-root sa Mount Pinatubo. And then they also believe nga ang Mount Pinatubo mo na ilang god. So they call it the Namalyari. They call it Apo Namalyari. And then they also believe nga ang spirits sa ancestors kay adto galive sa Mount Pinatubo. So katong gipa-evacuate sila sa government, kay they found it hard like to leave sa ilang home. Kay they know nga if kusubra kaayo ang volcanic eruption, nadyo'y chance nga ibalik nila, wala sila ibalikan. So So, kani nga situation sa aita nga community and sa ilang home nga pa Pinatubo, kay it just shows nga ang natural disasters kay dili jud siya maka-affect ka sa environment or maka-affect pud siya sa community.
With all said and done, that will be all for today's episode. Thank you everyone who's watching and have a nice day. Bye!